Yes, this is Brian McLaren, and we just heard kind of what's going on next week. I would encourage you guys to come. I also encourage you to be evangelists for Brian McLaren and let your friends and neighbors know. I hope after today, if you don't know him, you will not only have a better sense of who he is, but you'll be excited about what he's going to say next week. So I encourage you to invite folks to come. It's a treat for us to have him. What I want to do today is I want to introduce you to Brian. Show of hands, who has heard of Brian McLaren or read him before? All right, with your hands still raised, those of you who have heard of him, who knows something halfway significant about him, or just know the name? Okay, all right, okay. Well, I want to, for those of you who may not know him, I want to introduce you to who he is. He's got a really interesting story that informs his work. And I want to give you a kind of, I call it Brian has written lots and lots and lots of books. And as Gerald asked me to do this class, I thought about how I was going to do this class. And so I want to give you what is unapologetically my own opinion about Brian's kind of big picture vision that informs a lot of his work. I've not read all of his books, but if you've read a few of them, you see a similar pattern emerge. And so I want to kind of describe that for you all. And then rather than do a 30-book book report, I thought we would work from one of the books that he wrote that is one that I use in teaching a lot. And we're gonna work through that a little bit together. And then at the end of the class, I want to hear from you guys. And you can always interrupt me as you go and say, Pen, that doesn't make any sense, or I challenge your opinion on that, and that's okay. Let me tell you a little bit about who Brian is. Born in 1956, he was a student at University of Maryland. He had a degree, undergrad and grad in English. He was an English professor at colleges in the DC area. And then in 1982, he began to plant a church called the Cedar Ridge Community Church. It was non-denominational. And then in 1996, he left teaching and became the founding pastor of that church. He was there for 20 years. And then after that, he took his skills to the larger circuit and began to lecture. He is a podcaster, a speaker, and he's written tons of books. He calls himself an activist. I want to talk about that in a little bit. Raise your hand if you've heard of Richard Rohr. Yeah, I thought you might have heard of him. Brian is now on the faculty of the Center for Action and Contemplation, which is Richard Rohr's organization. So that is his kind of current mainstay of employment. And you'll see some of this journey. Can I go back? Yeah, let me see for a second. Okay. Before I get to his work, I wanted to tell you, this is a little a caveat. I really like Brian, and one of the things I like about Brian the most is that he is non-denominational. I say that as a Presbyterian pastor in a dark suit standing before Presbyterians on a Sunday morning in Sunday school at First Presbyterian Church of Charlotte. So I recognize the irony of that. But what I want you to see kind of underneath what I'll teach you about Brian and his work is that I think it's precisely because he doesn't come from an esteemed tradition that comes with it, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, some baggage and some expectations that we all carry because we think we have to carry on that tradition. And some of that is great. But what's refreshing about Brian is that he asks questions that on the face seem like they're simple and obvious, but when you allow yourself to read them and listen to them, you recognize that your own tradition has probably answered the question he's asking for you. And if you ask it yourself, you actually might learn something significant. Does that make sense? So what I appreciate about Brian the most is that he has a freedom and a willingness to ask the question about the church and the world that is not the same kind of question that I ask as someone who's been a Presbyterian my whole life and a minister for 23 years. And I just find that really energy and life-giving. So, okay, some of this is like a snapshot of what Brian has done, and you'll kind of see a progression of it. Can we get rid of that top? It's not a huge deal. Okay.
It got worse.
Not there yet.
That's higher up, yeah.
That's a little bit better. Okay. So starting from your left, so Brian started out, he got book deals from publishers and he would do like 3 books at a time. I'm not gonna go through all of them. This book right here called A Generous Orthodoxy is the one that really put him on the map. It also made him controversial, and I want to talk about why he was controversial. If I ask you just on the face of it, knowing nothing at all about this church, what is your impression of Cedar Ridge Community Church outside of Washington, D.C., non-denominational church? How would you just make a snap judgment? What would your impression be of a church like that?
Liberal.
Lowest common denominator.
Liberal, interesting.
Evangelical.
I would say.
Evangelical, it was, yeah, very evangelical. What else?
Contemporary,
Contemporary,
large.
yep. What else?
Non-liturgical.
Non-liturgical, right. The church was pretty conservative theologically. It was evangelical. And one of the things that Brian began to do as he dug, and to be clear, if you didn't miss it, Brian was not theologically trained. He got a degree in English and then another degree in English. He got a couple of honorary doctorates from different seminaries, which is the way to go. Just get it. But, and I want to say too, like, when I began to read Brian, I had my own kind of snooty, well, I mean, I guess I'll deign to read this man who's never been to seminary like I have. He knows a lot more about theology than I do, and that a lot of other people do that have been theologically trained. So my point is, when he wrote this book, Generous Orthodoxy, it really challenged the pretty strong and fundamentalist doctrine of some of the evangelical, non-denominational types of churches. And I've never read him say this, actually, although I haven't read every word he's written, but I think that book is the reason that he left parish ministry and got into speaking and writing, because he all of a sudden kind of outgrew his church's theology. Yes, Gerald.
I'm not sure your mic is on.
Oh, it says it is.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
No.
it's just for show. Let me use this.
How's everybody? Is everybody, you can hear everybody in the back?
Is that better? Is that good?
No, we're good.
No.
Okay, but it sounds like you're using your preacher voice.
I'm using my preacher voice. That's right. So up until this book, it was just kind of like, it wasn't milquetoast, but it was kind of, he didn't get too provocative. And then after this book, he began to ask some more fundamental questions that, and also, if you're gonna make a living, I mean, let's be serious, if you're gonna make a living lecturing and writing books, you kind of have to be provocative, because that's how you get an invitation. We're gonna talk some about this book later today. We make the road by walking. I bet there's some people who've read that book in this room. Who's read that book? Yep. For the sake of the Willard lecture, Brian is going to be talking about this book, Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. That actually comes out next month. So that's what I've not read yet. I didn't get an advanced copy. That's what we're going to talk
We
about.
have one if you want one.
Oh, good. Okay. Okay, some assumptions that I make about Brian and his purpose based on my reading of his work. And the first one is one I want to really underscore, because I think it's easy for people who write and talk in order to provoke us to think, it's easy for us to get defensive. And one of the things I want you to know that is not just my opinion is that Brian writes a lot about the church and what the church needs to do to improve, and what the church, he's kind of in some ways, an agitator of the church, but he loves the church. And he believes to his core that God uses the church, big C, all churches, as an instrument for God's purposes in the world. And so whatever you read from Brian or hear him say next week, you need to know that if it feels like it's stepping on your toes, it's because he loves the church so much that he wants all churches to dig into their mission and to do what God needs them to do in the world. And I think that's important. The second point I want to make about kind of Brian's story and his overall purpose is that Brian has a definite personal story about being grieved and disillusioned by his experience of the church that he pastored, and of church leaders that he's experienced. Sometimes because he thinks that churches think too small, and he fundamentalism. I don't know if anybody had a story in their own upbringing about being a part of a fundamentalist church, but I did not. I can imagine if I did, it would all of a sudden feel like a coat that was kind of suffocating, and Brian certainly had that experience. And because he thinks the church, one of his critiques of the church is that we're the chaplain to the status quo instead of being God's instrument for healing and change. And so that's a claim, and it's one that he doesn't just think about theoretically, but he's experienced personally. The third thing he would say is that there are big issues facing the world, and those issues are the churches and followers of Jesus's business. So, in his writing, you can see that, he kind of started feeling like he needed to make the case for why the environment was a theological issue. He doesn't make that argument anymore. He believes and has a conviction that I find refreshing, that the challenges and problems that face the world are the church's challenges. That it's not just that we need to kind of nurture ourselves and do a good job and kind of create a community of support, but we need to actually empower members of the body of Christ to be out in the world doing the work. And the fourth thing, this also has created some controversy for some. In pursuit of the church's work and in the joy of being known by God, Brian thinks that dividing lines of difference around doctrine are of minimal importance. And I wrote in parentheses, postmodern. That's a fancy word for the world is complicated, and he cares a lot less about what you call yourself and whether you're following a doctrine. And the questions of pluralism are just with us. And rather than fight to make sure that you're right, Brian's much more interested in what are we going to do as followers of Jesus. So he talks a lot in a number of his books about the difference between orthodoxy, you know what that word means? Right belief, and orthopraxy, right practice. And he thinks that there's really not, we're kind of wasting our time if we're worried about whether or not we can convince each other that we believe the right ways. So as you can imagine, that that steps on some people's toes. It doesn't step on mine. So, questions about any of that? All right. Okay. So what time do we have? When do we have to be out of here?
10:45.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna touch on a few of these. I had a grand vision of going through all 10 of these questions. I'm often outsized in my beliefs of what I can accomplish in a certain period of time. And so we're just gonna touch on a few of these, but the book that he wrote called A New Kind of Christianity, if you're interested in just a quick, pretty easy read, I would recommend this book because I hope you'll be intrigued by some of these questions. I'm not going to go into all of them. The subtitle of the book is 10 Questions That Are Transforming the Faith. This is written in 2011. You'll see evidence of that in a little bit. But again, like he's able to ask questions in a fresh way that seems simple, but they challenge the nature of what I think a lot of us have come to assume. So let me dig into this first one. The first question he asks in this book, he calls the narrative question. What is the shape or storyline or plot line of the biblical narrative? What is the Bible about? What problem is it trying to solve? What are the essential conflicts and projects that move the story along? I want you to answer that question. Seriously, what do you think the shape or the plot line of the biblical, what is the Bible about? Just a light question on Sunday morning. I really want you to answer it, and I want to ask you too, have you thought about that before? Yes.
Well, I think it's about love, about trying to always love others than yourself.
That's a great answer. Yeah. What else? Yes.
How about God's relationship with man?
Yeah, God's relationship with man or humanity. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more contemporary philosophical framing, but sort of what do we owe to God and what do we owe to each other?
Yeah. What do we owe to God? What do we owe to each other? Okay. Those are great answers. Let me show you what Brian, well, actually, okay, let's see. I need 4 volunteers from the class just to come up here with me. Gerald, you're gonna be Jesus. So you come on up.
Well, I want to stand with Jesus.
Yeah. 3, one more. Don't be shy. Who else is gonna come up? I'm gonna call on names. Linda, come on. Okay. Now that, again, you're gonna see this is simple, but it also challenges some assumptions, okay? So Gerald is Jesus. Hi, Gerald. Yeah. Okay, so Gerald, you stand here. Thank you. Linda, you're here. Roger. Okay. One of the things that Brian does in the book as a visual is he tries to get us to understand he tries to get us to recognize how we understand the things that we believe. All right, this is a great high school youth group activity. Bill, you are Billy Graham. Okay. And Roger, you are Pope Benedict.
Whoa.
And Linda, you are John Calvin.
Oh.
All right? And Gerald, you're Jesus. And I am you. And I'm trying to understand who Jesus is. And Brian's point is that whenever the way we come to our knowledge about our faith is that we read it this way. What we know about Jesus is informed by Billy Graham and Pope Benedict, maybe, and John Calvin. And not even that, it's other people's opinion about John Calvin and Billy Graham. Okay? Thank you. Well done. Well done. In that first chapter of this book, McLaren holds up this diagram, and I don't know if Can you see that on the screen?
I'm sure that we
Is
got
the
it.
owl showing you? Hello.
Yes, it's a little blurry.
Okay,
Oh, we can send it out.
we'll send it out. Okay. Can you guys see this diagram? Okay, so, you start with an ideal. You dip down to reality. And then you resurface to an ideal and, or you don't. Okay, what is that? Just any guesses about what that is? What narrative that is? What does that remind you of? An ideal? You dip down to, what the world really is. And then you return to an ideal or you don't.
Resurrection, maybe, life, death, and resurrection.
Okay,
Well,
the fall? Yeah. All right. This is where Brian challenged me. This is kind of a light bulb moment. Do we have any philosophy students in the room? Anybody took philosophy? This is Greco-Roman philosophy. The Platonic ideal, Aristotelian real, and then the ideal again. Brian's point is, this is one example of the ways that we have laid our experience and our traditions on top of our interpretation of Jesus. Doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong or that there's not units of truth in this, but a lot of people read the Bible this way. Genesis 1, Revelation 21. End of story. You guys see that? And so that's why these kind of questions to me are provocative, because he challenges that. Y'all gave great answers. The Bible, the narrative of the Bible is love, the triumph of love. It's the relationship between God and humanity. It's not a flat, Greco-Roman understanding of some fatalistic past and future. The other thing he says, and I'm really gonna jump to the end here because I'm droning on. But another metaphor, he asks or trots out with this question, what does it mean to say the Bible has authority? He talks about, you can read the Bible a lot of ways, but a lot of Christians view the Bible as they would the Constitution. That the Bible is the rule book. Clean the air filter. Wow. I'm full of it.
It should disappear.
All right. I looked at y'all's faces and I was like, wow, that. But a lot of Christians read the Bible as the Constitution, that our role is to go to the Bible and find the answer and build our argument. And that's one way to read the Bible. One of the metaphors Brian uses is that the Bible is a library. And in that library, there are different types of literature. They're written in different times by different people. When you go to a library, the goal, just kind of big picture, is to know. It's not necessarily, I mean, if you keep going to the library again and again and again over your life, you will emerge with a deeper appreciation for the world and who you are and who God is. And so those are very different ways to read the Bible. So that's one example of another question that he asks. I'm going to flip through these because I've got questions for you at the end. The God question, is God violent? Nobody's ever asked that before. Who is Jesus and why is he important? We think we know the answer to that, but it's worth lingering on. What do we do about the church? What future should our local congregations or denominations and the Christian community pursue? What is the vision for the future? Is the world getting worse and worse until God destroys it and replaces it? Better and better until it's perfect? Just light questions like this. How should followers of Jesus relate to people of other religions? Is Jesus the only way? And the only way to what? Can we have both a strong sense of Christian identity and a strong sense of hospitality and love? So let me ask you particularly this question as we engage with each other. I'm just curious, after this very brief dip into Brian's work. Actually, let me skip to the third question. What is something about Christianity that you have had to unlearn? And can you identify any other assumptions about Christianity that you will have to eventually unlearn? Sometimes we know what we need to unlearn, and we're not quite ready to unlearn it, but we know, like, I'll get to that in a few years. But is there anything about the faith that you were taught that you've had to unlearn? Claire.
Well, basically, all of our doctrine was created by human beings. God sent the Ten Commandments. God sent Jesus. God did not send the Westminster Confession or whatever.
Yeah. I'm not sure your catechism teacher in the 4th grade believed that, but. Yeah. What else have you had to unlearn? Bert?
The punishment orientation of so much of the preaching, and while there's an element of truth to that, that's not the nature of God.
There are a lot of sermons for a lot of years where the only purpose of the preaching was to avoid that. And I would suggest to you that that is not a very compelling or durable theology, if that's the only point of what we're doing. Yeah. Yeah. What else have you had to unlearn? Yeah.
Well, once I got to know people in other countries of different religions, really different religions, I had a question: is the only way to live as a Christian, to get to heaven through our Christian religion? I've met a lot of really, really good people that I just wondered, are they damned?
Yeah. I think,
I've lived in other countries.
Don, I forget the precise number. I knew it because I used it in a sermon about 10 years ago, but it's changed. But at one point I knew how many different languages were spoken in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. And it's like 200. Yeah. And, my kids, that's their work. It's not that they're, I traveled to experience that. It's in my kids' schools. And so that question is one that is a very relevant question for them, because they're, they go to birthday parties and they date and they, whatever they do on their phones, do they do that too with these kids? Yeah. What else have you had to unlearn? Yeah, Bo.
I think the idea that being Christian is just only a declaration of allegiance. That like, it's actually a fairly complicated work order that requires a lot of discernment and a lot of doubling back and a lot of falling off of ledges and looking for roads back up. I did not, it was presented as sort of like, the boxes checked, you're good. And then I was like, well, checking the box is quite a commitment. To figure out.
Yeah.
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 Riffing on that, it's a journey, not a destination.
Yeah. That's right. And let me ask you a follow-up to that, this third question. How does knowing, danger, ready? I'm gonna ask you a question about your feelings. It's Sunday morning, just that's your heads up. How does knowing that you've had to unlearn some things about your faith and that there probably are more you'll have to unlearn, how does that make you feel?
I think I've had to unlearn, that knowing that doesn't minimize the impact of Jesus in my own life. Or, you know, and that's risky. It makes me feel like, oh, I don't think I want to go there because then something that really is my life, hopefully, is going to be shattered.
Yeah.
But it's not true. I don't think that's really true. That's the risk.
About if I really want to deepen my relationship with God, if I really want to reflect His love, I have to go in other directions, receive examples and ideas and a way of worshiping God that is not offered in the regular church.
When I think about other religions and learn about them, and maybe not even their religions, it really broadens me. It opens my mind. I like it. Just, you know, the Dalai Lama and what those other groups have to say opens me up.
Claire, did you hear?
No, I did not.
The second question you can have there,
Yeah.
was that you will have to eventually learn. How do I know what those assumptions? When do I know?
Let me-
to unlearn them?
Let me answer it and see if this makes sense to you, or I'll answer it for myself. All right, don't bring up on charges, heresy charges. Or, and I mean this sincerely, don't interpret what I'm gonna say as in any way a lack of appreciation for a church in which I am incredibly connected to and committed to and have been shaped by. But I don't know if denominations matter. That's something I think I'm gonna have to unlearn what it is to be a particular brand of Christian. Because, and I say, I could not have said that 10 years, 12 years, I might not have gotten this job if I said that. But I mean, I've seen that happening where there is a broadening and there are a lot of things I think we think as Presbyterians that other people are gonna figure out by osmosis, and then 10 years later, we realize they haven't figured it out yet, but they're still here, and they're not here because of the precise way that we organize our theology, but they're here for other reasons. And so that's, I don't quite know what that is going to look like, but that's an example of something that I can just tell is changing.
Yeah, that's certainly because, you know, we had a brand as Presbyterian. I think there's some pride, some pride that's developed, and I'm sure that's true of Episcopalians and Baptists and so forth. It's something that kind of it creates a divide that shouldn't be there at all.
Right.
So I'm wondering, I think, Bill, your question had to do with how we know what in the future. And I'm wondering if it's those, you mentioned pride, and I think that's a great description, and I'm wondering if the things that we might need to unlearn are the things that we're clinging to right now, or, if somebody really smart has this image of, if it's an idol now, if it's something that we really value, that might be the very thing that we have to let go of. So maybe if we examine those things that we're like desperately clawing onto, that might give us a clue about maybe somehow something is working within us for us to examine it.
Yeah. So I want to finish, and we'll let you out a little bit early. I want to finish by circling back to, from the place of like realizing that there's some things we haven't unlearned. There's some things we're going to have to unlearn. Part of what I think Brian McLaren tries to do is help followers of Jesus do that and get comfortable with that. Because, and I don't know who said it, it was somebody over here, because I think it was you, Glenna. I'll tell you who's not threatened by the questions that we're asking or the things we might need to unlearn, and that's Jesus. So like that doesn't change. And from Brian's perspective, I just want to remind you that all this provocative thought, all these questions are asked by someone who really believes that the church is God's instrument in the world. And so that also, it'll look different. It should look different. And the things they're idols, we're gonna have to kind of set aside when we figure out what they are. But the grand narrative is that God still uses the church. Maybe not only the church, but God still uses the church as an instrument for God's purpose in the world. And so like, I hope that gives me a sense of hope, and it quiets my change of verse nature down and my anxiety down, because I know that, the one we worship is sturdy enough to handle all of our doubts and questions, and has borne plenty of our wrong assumptions for a long, long time, and is still able to bring truth and love and grace to a world that needs it. So that's all I got. Yeah.
Can you speak to a minute about the 3-week sermon series that starts next week?
Yes, it is. Well, and I'll say too, I have an idea of that, but I don't know what Brian is gonna preach, so it might be a 2-week sermon series that I'm gonna do. But this book, Do I Stay Christian? A Guide for the Doubters and the Disappointed and the Disillusioned. That is, I'm at least gonna preach 2 sermons on that book. I think Brian's gonna preach 1, but I'm not entirely sure. And the idea of that you may hear that, and that may just like, I don't know what you feel as you hear the title of that book. If you feel like, why are we talking about that? But I think that question, do I stay Christian, is a question that my kids are gonna be asking themselves. And I think it's really good for the church to think about what is the value proposition for what we do here, for what we believe. And so, and I have found it helpful to say, like, acknowledge that kind of stuff out loud in the pulpit. You'd be amazed, whenever I've talked about doubt from the pulpit, I get more emails than when I talk about any other, except when I make John Tate mad, and then I get a lot of emails. But when I talk about doubt from the pulpit, it gives people permission that I don't know if they know they have, to acknowledge that. So that's the sermon series after, at least for 2 weeks, if not 3. Yeah, Tom.
may have already implicitly conveyed this, but you started by talking about how controversial a generous orthodoxy was. Can you just share briefly what the nature of that controversy was?
Briefly, Tom, I would say it was, Brian started his, ecclesiological journey, church journey from the non-denominational evangelical church. And he has, because of his willingness to, ask the questions that he has and kind of, and go with those questions, he has kind of migrated to, there's not a category for what kind of church he's in now, but, I'll put it this way. What's a evangelical? Elevation Church is not gonna invite Brian McLaren to be their lecturer. Because it challenges some of the pretty strong doctrinal, beliefs that they have on certain things. Yeah.
One of the other things that in his growing up, he grew up in an evangelical church and he began to see in his church a disconnect with how he read the gospel. And so part of it for his church was who's in and who's out. Do you believe correctly or do you not? Who's saved and who's not? And he read the gospel in a way that saw it for everyone. Jesus came for everyone. And so he began to see that disconnect. And I think that's what has developed through his life. That's part of what's developed through his
Yeah.
life.
And I would say too, like, I hadn't connected these dots, but this book was written to try to help people in the church where Brian started. And this book is written to try to help people who are Brian's audience now. And so that's the evolution, I recognize in his work. Yeah. All right. Good to be with you. Thank you.
That's-